I do believe people are taking on debt unnecessarily. And so one of the things I've been going on about for a number of years is the census date. And so hopefully a student audience knows this, but the census date is usually about a month into semester. If you withdraw prior to the census date, you don't accrue any help debt. If you leave after that, you are charged help regardless of whether you actually finish the course or pass the course or anything like that. And evidence that I did at Grattan and other people have done since shows that lots of people have poor awareness of the census date. Sometimes they're never even turning up to class, but they have failed to actually formally end their enrolment. As a result, they are completely pointlessly accumulating help debt.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Sunday Sessions, brought to you by the Macquarie University Liberal Club. My name is Isabella Anderson and I'm joined with Samrat Joshua Groal, and today we're going to be discussing student debt. As recently the Biden administration announced a plan to forgive student debt, and it has sparked a discussion about how we handle the outstanding loans placed on students as they embark on their journeys at universities. To discuss this uphill battle of student debt, we are joined by an expert in the field of higher education policy, Professor Andrew Norton. Andrew is currently a professor in the practice of higher education at the Centre for Social Research and Methods at ANU, and Andrew was also a member of the 2013 to 2014 government review of the demand-driven system for funding of higher education, as well as being a part of the expert panel advising on higher education reform over 2016 to 2017. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So we'll jump straight into it, and we'll start off with just the basics. So could you tell us just a bit about how HECS or HELP was established and what the original intentions were when it was created?
Well, it started in 1989 after a period of about 15 years of free higher education in Australia. And the minister at the time, a guy called John Dawkins, was one of the big reforming figures in Australian higher education, essentially had one big problem, was he wanted to increase participation in Australian higher education. There was a baby boom coming through the school system, and year 12 completion had gone from about 30% to 70-something%. So the potential increase in demand for higher education was huge. His problem was the government wasn't willing to spend huge amounts of money creating all these additional places, and so he had to find some other way of doing it. And so at this point, kind of normal fees, like you say in the United States, could have been introduced, but a guy called Bruce Chapman, who recently retired at the ANU, came up with the idea of an income contingent loan. And so that is, you are charged something if you're going to university, but you only repay if and when you reach a threshold income, which is currently about $48,000. Below that, you repay nothing. Beyond that, you pay an escalating percentage of your income, depending on how much you earn. So it was really started to expand the higher ed system. And it has been very successful in that, but I'm sure we're going to get on to the problems that have been associated with it.
So this year will see a huge increase in repayments by almost 4% compared to previous years. Do we know that inflation is a contributing factor to that, student debt repayments?
So repayments, just talking about the indexation of the debt. So so since the loan scheme was started, there has been CPI, so consumer price inflation indexation of debt, and the aim of that is to retain its real value for the Commonwealth government. At various points, there have been attempts to introduce real interest rates above that, but they've all failed. So generally, this hasn't been terribly controversial because through most of the time we've had HECS and then HELP, which started in 2005, which is a bit of a rebrand of it and an expansion to new things. Inflation has typically been quite low in Australia. There's only been a few spurts of inflation. And the last time it did spurt briefly in the late 2000s, the number of people with debt was much lower than today, and the average amount of debt they had was much lower than today. So really, we've had this period where, because annual indexation has often been very low, so 2% or below in recent years, the annual 1st of June indexation has come and gone with very little comment. But as you would know, we're in an inflationary period at the moment. And so it was 3.9% for the 1st of June this year. And it's actually going to get worse than that because that just captured. So inflation didn't really take off until June last year. It's still going. And for some reason, some historical reason, I'm not quite sure, it's actually inflation averaged over the preceding 2 years. So what that means is that this current burst of inflation will still be influencing indexation after it has stopped in the broader economy. And so I think this is going to be an interesting period for the politics of help debt because, as you would have seen, the media and social media was full of complaints about this this year in a way that it hadn't been in preceding years.
So I saw a government statistic that around 15% of students won't be able to pay back their student loan. So what happens when you can't pay it back or you don't pay it back when you graduate?
Yes, that's the estimate of each year's lending that they expect won't be repaid. And this is, some debt not repaid is part of the design of the scheme. It is supposed to transfer some of the risk of borrowing onto government and taxpayers. Now, in other countries, such as the UK, your debt is written off after 30 years. In Australia, it's only written off on death. But at the moment, at that point, it's gone. There's nothing taken out of your estate. So the debt dies with you effectively. So there's really no penalty to that for you. And so this is one of the big differences between our loan scheme and, say, the American loan systems. They've got several loans, but there you've got a typical mortgage style loan, fixed repayments each month or each year. If you don't repay, you default, it goes on your credit record. It can affect your capacity to borrow for all sorts of other things, your credit card, a house, a car, all these other things. And so in those countries, not being able to pay your student debt is a serious problem. In Australia, you've got it hanging over you potentially till you die, but if you're not earning above that $48,000, you won't actually have to make any financial payment.
And on that, do you believe that there needs to be an adjustment that threshold is brought down, especially with the increasing cost of living at the moment? And also, as you said, it's to move the financial risk. It's not to actually entirely fund it. It's just to remove the risk from the student whilst they're in such a low-income, vulnerable time in their life. What do you think needs to be done, including that the cost of borrowing for the government is going up as well? Does that interest rate need to increase to assist the government in supporting this?
So I've opposed a real rate of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Not totally opposed to it in principle, but I think politically it can never work. Like, it's been put up several times before and always failed. And one of the reasons for this is it'll tend to disproportionately impact women who take time out of the workforce and therefore time out of repaying their help debt. And so while they're not repaying, sure, they don't have to pay anything to the government, but the amount they have to eventually repay is going up due to the real rate of interest. And because of that, it's always been politically toxic. And whenever it's been put up, it's been withdrawn by the government because it knows it can't sell it. There are alternatives, such as a loan fee, for example, adding a percentage to your debt, which does happen to some students already. So that's one way of managing it in a more predictable way. The threshold, I think, is the big political question, the first threshold in particular. Like, it has been much higher than it is now. If it had been stayed on the preceding system, it would be $60-something thousand now, rather than the $48,000 it actually is. The difficulty with a high threshold is that obviously a lot more of the debt will never be repaid because people, particularly people who work part-time, earn less than $60-something thousand a year typically. And it makes the scheme totally unsuited to extending to vocational students, which they have some eligibility now, but not nearly as much as higher education. And so if it's going to be a genuine tertiary education scheme, which I think many people want it to be, so that people in the vocational system don't have to pay their fees up front, then it needs to be realistic about the kinds of incomes that people with diplomas and certificates have compared to those with bachelor degrees.
So in the USA, student debt's a huge toxic issue.
Yeah.
If you bring it up, you're going to get shouted at or have something thrown at you. So in the USA, they pay off the debts in one transaction. Do you know why that is?
No, it's not one transaction, but it's installments. The difference between theirs is that you repay a fixed amount. So it might be 10 or 12 years. And so kind of like a mortgage here, they'll work out what you need to pay each month or each whatever the repayment period is and stagger that over time. And so if you have any period of low earnings in that 10 or 12 years, and that first part of your career is often quite a vulnerable phase where you might spend some time out of work, particularly at the start when you're looking for a job, that's going to lead to problems. So that is why I think this has become such a huge issue in the United States. And so one way to sort of get around this risk is for the government just to wipe out some of the debt, which has happened for, I think it's $10,000 of debt wiped out by Joe Biden. But I think the problem with that is it just makes the longer term economics of the whole higher ed system less viable. To take the Australian context, go back to the start of HECS. Like, this money was used to expand resources in higher education. And if you just wipe out debt, what you're effectively doing is reducing the capacity to fund the higher education system. And so you have to ask, ultimately, are students going to benefit from that? I guess my view is probably not. These costs have to be paid for somehow. And the question is how to do it in a way that covers the costs, but also manages the associated risks to the students. And I think Helpin has done this pretty well.
How is the Australian approach to student debt different from the American approach?
Oh, very radically. So it's really that critical difference is the difference between a fixed mortgage style loan system where you repay fixed amounts over a fixed period of time and our system where the amounts you repay can go to zero without affecting your credit rating or adjust your income. So, for example, if you're on the base income for repaying now, which is just over $48,000, your annual repayment will be less than $500. So, fairly low amount of money. At the top of the spectrum, you repay 10% of your entire income. So surprisingly, the ATO's records show that there are a few help debtors reporting taxable income over $1 million. And so if you're earning $1 million, your repayment is $100,000. So that is way more than a mortgage style system would require you to pay. So it's more at that end, but the $500 at the bottom end is way lower than a mortgage style system would require you to repay.
You mentioned about how the money is essentially needed in order to actually provide this service. And that is the whole reasoning behind it, why it was brought in. So there was actually the availability of services to be able to provide it. So we saw a lot of staff cuts during COVID, and there was a lot of backlash that universities received regarding that from students saying to not cut staff. But then you also have the same students arguing, forgive our debt. So do you think there needs to be greater clarity around what HELP or HECS is?
Well, I guess my view is the loan scheme is reasonably simple compared to other countries, but people don't necessarily understand, I think, the realistic alternatives here. So people say education should be free. And we could have a free education system in Australia, like we've had it before. But to me, the consequences would be twofold. One is the same amount of money from the government would have to be stretched much further. So I think there'll be two things happen. One would be there will be fewer student places to begin with. So a whole lot of people who are at uni now wouldn't be under a free system. And probably the resources per student would go down as well. And so presumably there's some relationship between spending and quality. The quality of education received would also go down. So, that would be, the price would convert from a dollar amount that students pay to fewer people going to uni, and those who do go getting a lower quality experience.
Do you think, so for example, nursing, for example, before used to be in a form of apprenticeship style, and then now it has turned into a degree. Do you think there's a potential where courses that are provided as a degree can instead be trained in a form of apprenticeship style? Do you think that might be any form of potential future?
Like, nursing is a kind of a vexed issue. Like, it was an apprenticeship until kind of a generation ago. And there were two reasons why it changed. One was that a lot of nursing is genuinely quite sophisticated. It has got a theoretical knowledge that has normally been the dividing line between a vocational system and the higher education system. And the other is, status issues, that effectively higher education in Australia has become higher status than vocational education. And so nurses wanted that respect of having a degree within the health system compared to the old nursing training system. But the downside for them has been that they've been caught up in a higher ed system where students are charged when apprentices often aren't. Indeed, apprentices are often paid while they study. And so nursing is a more expensive course to do now than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago. But I think once an occupation has made the transition to a profession, I don't know of any example of one going back. And so I think there'd be political hell to pay if you tried to do that. And probably it would make nursing less attractive to people who do actually want to be nurses.
Yeah, as you would know, the Greens Party kind of supports the abolition of student loans or student debt forgiveness. Do you think there's any merit in a policy like that? I know it's something that Joe Biden's also doing in the USA right now.
So it goes similar question to my one about free education more broadly, that yes, we could do that, but it would mean that the education system as a whole would be worse. The Greens, to their credit, did find other ways of funding it. That is, substantially increasing taxes on wealthier people. But that obviously has its own political downsides. The one interesting aspect of this, I think, is that a lot of what the welfare state is kind of move consumption and expenditure around your life cycle. And so both the subsidies and the loan scheme work to push the cost of your education away from your late teens, early 20s, when most people don't have any substantial income, to a later period. That's really twofold. One is the help repayment period, where you're directly covering your own costs. And then the way the income tax system works is that typically you're your biggest net taxpayer later in your career when your earnings peak. And so the kind version of the Greens argument is it's more effectively transferring the costs to that later period in life when you earn more, and probably some of the original expenses like buying a house or raising children are complete or nearly complete. But I do think it runs an enormous risk of shrinking the size of the higher ed system. And if we look at most European, though not the Scandinavian countries, we actually see the countries with free or very cheap higher education actually have lower participation rates than we do in Australia or England or the US, other countries that have fees as well as public funding.
On that, in the comparison of other states and states, countries, and how they function with higher education, do you believe there needs to be greater intervention from the government in terms of providing these subsidies? Or do you think moving towards more of a free market would actually enable potentially the functioning of economics and regarding to supply and demand and people going into it and bargaining for what degrees are necessary and what the potential economic output would be in the future?
So we did have what I call a quasi-market system for about 10 years called the demand-driven system, which applied to the public universities only, which is a bit of a limitation. But basically that meant that the universities were funded for whoever they could enrol in a bachelor degree, whatever domestic students they could enrol in a bachelor degree, which contrasts to the systems before and after, where each university is effectively given a capped amount of money. And really, generally, there's no incentive to take many students above that cap, because basically you won't be paid the public subsidy for them. And so that tends to be anti-competitive. It tends to freeze the system in time. So the demand-driven system, where the public subsidy was still there, that caused very big changes in the enrolment distribution across Australia, and changed both between universities and between disciplines. So that's kind of one way of mimicking a market. I used to support deregulated fees as well on top of that. But over time, I changed my mind. And there are really two reasons for that. One was the more research I did on the help loan scheme, the more I realized that this extra money borrowed would never be repaid. And so it effectively end up as a subsidy from the taxpayer anyway, which is not what we want. And the second was I realized that particularly in the international market, universities are making huge profits out of teaching, and they're spending that money on research rather than teaching on the whole. And so I thought really having students and the help scheme fund the research ambitions of Australian universities, I don't think is a particularly good policy. And therefore I reversed my previous support of that policy. It's not to say that we shouldn't change the student contributions or anything like that, but it does mean that I think a full-on deregulation would not be a good policy.
So how much do international students factor into the HECS help debt? Do they have to worry about it once they move back overseas?
So they're not eligible for a student loan in Australia. So they are the free market we just talked about. Many of them do get loans from family, and sometimes there are scholarships from their home countries, but they have it very tough. They pay way more on average than domestic students pay, and they get no subsidy, no loan, have to support themselves living in a foreign country. Like, this is a very tough gig, and it's amazing we have so many in such an unfavourable system.
Do you think there needs to be greater scrutiny on HECS? So, for example, similar to youth allowance, taking into consideration the household income, what the parents' income might be, what potentially might be inherited, any other, in order to, in a way, try and, because it is very overly generous to a point.
So I don't think the parents' income of the student should be taken into account, because I think the system is designed to free you of the whatever financial constraints your parents put on you. But we do have this issue of most of the welfare system and the tax system takes into account family circumstances, but the help repayment system does not. This works both ways, that you could argue that families with young children possibly should have a higher threshold for repayment because of the pressures of funding their family. On the other hand, two income couples where the second income earner, usually the wife, is chugging along on a part-time job below the threshold and not repaying a help debt, you could argue that she should be required to repay in those circumstances, even though her personal income is below the normal threshold. And I think that would actually, over time, particularly capture a lot of sort of mature age couples where one of the partners has a help debt and the other has cleared theirs.
In terms of types of degrees people are getting into, there's a huge kind of theme in the conservative world that there's a bunch of useless degrees out there, like gender studies and stuff like that. Should the usefulness of a degree kind of factor into student debt and whether you can get a loan for those degrees?
There actually is one only dubious degree, which is excluded from help, which is the Bachelor of Circus Arts at Swinburne University, an eccentric rule that a previous education minister made, which is probably a bit unfair. I think there was some story that they were teaching makeup for drag queens or something like that, and he banned it. So I think this is a really actually interesting philosophical question, and it sort of goes to the political relationship between universities and government. So this goes back to the medieval era where universities were sort of linked to the church, and their autonomy was linked to the religious freedom. And for various reasons, this is just carried forward into the secular university system. And universities have never been subject to the kind of meddling in content that happens all the time in vocational education and all the time in school curricula. And so I would argue that even though, I do realize there are courses that are not going to lead to good jobs, courses where people have, questioned the intellectual value of the content, but I actually think a sort of a broader philosophical perspective, we should tolerate this and say that overall the independence of universities from government is the more important principle. This has some downsides, but it's such an important principle, we should protect it and not intervene and say, we like this course, we don't like that course, which I think would just create more problems than it's worth.
So do you think the quality of courses correlates with the high price we pay in fees?
I don't think there's a huge link between them. particularly with the student contributions in Australia, where the student contribution is just one element of the funding rate that universities get, and sometimes quite a small element. The philosophical basis of the student contributions has really got nothing to do with quality of the course. But in the private sector, like, you do see that the fee-paying institutions like Bond University, often have much higher student satisfaction than do the public universities. And that's because the only way they can convince people to come and pay a higher fee is to give them an experience which is actually qualitatively different from what you would get at a public university. But I do not, as I said earlier, I do not believe Australia's public universities would do that. I think there's an institutional culture which favours research in those institutions, and therefore higher fees would not translate reliably into higher quality teaching or the student experience more broadly.
And on that previous question, and it's a really good point that you said that regardless of what your perspective is on a certain course, if anything, it's going backwards for government to intervene and say you can't teach that. With that, though, to try and obviously offset the debt that there is, do you think, we saw under Morrison that certain courses would have greater government support whereas other courses wouldn't, or the opposite way, where greater student contribution would be required for certain courses that weren't, you could say, in the national interest? So do you believe that's a method that would work in order the output that is going to be long-term given from that degree in the interest of Australia then will be determining what percentage is contributed by the student and the government?
So I've been arguing since Job Ready Graduates was announced that this is not going to work, that students do not choose courses based on the student contribution. The fundamental driver of course choice is interests. I think within your range of interests, you choose the course which is likely to get you a job and get you a decent salary. And I think that we haven't got a lot of data yet on the outcomes of Job Ready Graduates, but the data we have suggests that, if anything, demand for the courses with a higher fee, that's $14,500 for arts, for example, per year, has actually gone up. So totally contrary to what you'd expect from a pure economics argument. Remains to be seen if those applications convert into enrolments. We don't have that data yet, but not what we were expecting in terms of economic theory, but what I was expecting in terms of interests. The problem with this is, by sort of increasing the debt that humanities graduates have. Now, humanities graduates typically do not earn as much as graduates in other fields. And that actually means that what the government has done is probably shift some of the subsidy from direct subsidy at time of education to the loan scheme, where eventually they'll have to write off more of the debt that they have, given to people with humanities degrees. And so to me, that just doesn't seem like a very effective way of going about it. And it has this kind of negative side effect that even though you don't actually have to pay the help debt, unless your income reaches the threshold, you've still got to hang over you. And I know, talking to people about their help debt, even if it's not particularly financially onerous to them in terms of repayments each year, it nags at them. They don't like having it. And so I think it's not good social policy to have a typical graduate in a certain field having debt hanging over them potentially for decades or their entire lives. Much better to distribute the student contributions more closely to likely repayment prospects, and then hopefully, most people will clear their debts in 10 to 15 years' time.
So you wrote on your blog that there are more people repaying their loans while the amount attributed to repayment has decreased. What's the reason for that?
So the average repayment has gone down. Like, there's two things going on here. One is that there was a huge increase in student numbers during this demand-driven system that I talked about earlier. And these people are now in their repayment phase. And so increased enrolments has unsurprisingly flowed through to increased debtors. The other thing that's changed is that first threshold for repaying your help debt has gone down. So it was reduced in 2018-19, then again in 2019-20. As I said earlier, if this hadn't been changed, this threshold is indexed to inflation as well. If that hadn't been changed, it would be in the $60-something thousand now. Instead, it's around 48,000. And so there are lots and lots of people with income in that 48 to 60,000 range. And therefore, that has brought in many more of the people who have taken out help debt over the last 10 or 15 years into their repayment phase. But because of the cut in they've cut some of the percentages you have to repay in income, and people at the bottom are only paying $500 a year, that's meant that the average repayment has gone down. Total repayments are still up just by the sheer force of the numbers of people, but the average repayment is down.
In your 2015 Grattan report, you wrote that it was 10.2 billion of outstanding help debt was not expected to be paid, and that was in 2015. So, and I read it was estimated around 20 to 25% that would ultimately not be repaid entirely. So do you think that this is something that needs to be addressed quite quickly and immediately, considering inflation at the moment?
So there have been changes since that report, which I think go a fair way to solving this problem or reducing the cost of it. And so we did advocate in sort of a series of Grattan reports that we lower the threshold, and that is bringing many more people into repayment and will eventually lead to full repayment, in my view. We advocated that people overseas have to repay. That is happening. It's only about 13,000 people at this stage, but that is bringing in some extra money. The previous government also capped the amount of money that you can borrow. It's a bit over $100,000 in total, and that will prevent people getting into, I think there's someone who owes about 400,000 or something like that. So that will prevent, totally unpayable debts accumulating. So we have done a range of things to reduce that problem. But as said earlier, part of the design of this system is that some people will not repay. And so we should never try and get this to zero. But in my view, we can and should get it down to lower than it was tracking at, in the middle of the last decade.
So as a classical liberal, what's, in your opinion, the kind of best way to lower tuition fees? And do you think that could be done through market-oriented reforms, or?
I think, sadly, the answer to that is probably no. I think while you've got a very soft loan system like HELP, people are not going to be very sensitive to price. The whole point of the scheme is to desensitize you to price, and it does that very effectively. And that means that I think people on the whole are not going to be attracted to cheaper versions of the similar course. They'll do the course they want to do. I think on the whole, this is positive. It means people can invest what they think they need to invest in their studies. But it does have this downside that it blunts some of the competition on price that might otherwise exist, at least in that undergraduate market. In postgraduate, we do in fact see that universities charge a range of fees, usually fairly closely linked to their prestige levels. Again, not at all clear that students are getting a better quality teaching experience, but they are getting the status value of having a degree from a better known university. And so unfortunately, I think this is an area where markets are not working like they are in some other industries. It's more like the luxury good market where people in some ways want to pay a premium.
I briefly mentioned this before regarding the idea of turning some degrees into rather short courses or apprenticeship-like. Do you think that there needs to be a removal in a way from the stigma that surrounds if your education level, if you have a degree or not? So, because for example, if you want to go into a corporate world, it is expected that you have to have a degree. But I'm sure that there are ways where you can try and get into a position and then you'll be able to grow on your knowledge, and even your employer could try and pay for your education if that's needed. Do you think we need to step away where there's this influx of people going to university when really maybe it might not be necessary, and that we should look more towards trades and apprenticeships and other methods of education?
So I think some of the big consulting firms, particularly in the UK, have offered, straight out of school apprenticeship style models. And I think the reality is that probably in some areas, what you learn at university isn't massively useful in the business world, and you're better off just getting in there and learning what you need to know. On the other hand, I guess my advice would generally be that not having a degree in contemporary society creates risks for you that wouldn't exist otherwise. And if you could make a theoretical argument that it's a bit of a shame that we got to this situation, we have, and trying to reverse it, I think, is going to be extremely difficult. We've got to remember that we've had these arguments about over-education, excessive education for a long time. I think I've got a book sitting on my shelves called The Overeducated American, which was published in 1976, when relatively few people went to university compared to now. These arguments have been made constantly over the decades, but the reality is in not a single country, regardless of its ideology, its politics, its culture, have we succeeded in reducing the number of people with a degree. This, I think, is just a fundamental cultural, economic, social shift. And therefore, it's not going to work to say that we can do this on scale. I think people just simply won't do it. Some people will always manage to, succeed against the odds. But I would say for most people, if you want to maximize your opportunities, minimize your risks, getting a degree is probably still necessary. You could argue, don't waste time about it, get it done in your 3 years, but nevertheless, you still do need it.
You mentioned before that fee help, HECS help, they help desensitize students to the cost of attending university. Who do you think's accountable for the high cost of fees? Is it universities, the government, or is it students taking on these courses?
Well, I don't think the typical undergraduate course really is very expensive. Like, they're still typically priced at below cost. There's still, a very low percentage of what a graduate can expect to earn over their careers. In postgraduate, you do see, very expensive MBAs, for example, and particularly the courses, law courses. Some of the engineering and IT courses tend to be very expensive. And there, I think you probably are seeing some profiteering from the universities. But again, this is the area where we've got the strongest market signals. And so this is not an effective mechanism for reducing these prices. I think regulation has been the only effective way of reducing prices in higher education.
What would you suggest because you've provided all of these policy advising reports, what do you think is the most ideal method in order to move forward to guarantee debt repayment, but also try and offset this huge debt that's building?
Well, going back to sort of some of the earlier points, even though I don't think the courses are unreasonably priced as such, I do believe people are taking on debt unnecessarily. And so one of the things I've been going on about for a number of years is the census date. And so hopefully a student audience knows this, but the census date is usually about a month into semester. If you withdraw prior to the census date, you don't accrue any help debt. If you leave after that, you charge help regardless of whether you actually finish the course or pass the course or anything like that. And evidence that I did at Grattan and other people have done since shows that lots of people have poor awareness of the census date. Sometimes they're never even turning up to class, but they have failed to actually formally end their enrolment. And as a result, they are completely pointlessly accumulating help debt. So there was one university that found about 3% of all of its subjects, there was no evidence of any engagement by the student. That is, they never submitted any work. And so this is actually quite a serious problem, and some universities are acting on this. And then I think there are things like careers advice. A lot of people change their course after they start, and they don't necessarily get credit for the work they've already done. And so if you can make a better choice first time around, you'll end up with less debt in total. Now, I don't believe you can actually always get it right, that, life is a bit of an experiment. The course might sound good, but actually doesn't suit you in the end. But I do believe that we can reduce the total burden of help debt for both students and governments simply by making better choices. Or if you're deciding to drop out, do it and don't accumulate the debt.
Just wanted to quickly add on to that, though. The idea that students are just automatically taking on this debt and they're disregarding the census date and they're building up this unnecessary debt. And because it's not tangible in a sense where they can't see that debt that they're accruing, they essentially don't let it bother them. Do you think there needs to be a sense of accountability established, for example, where students are able to realize the cost that it's actually that they are building?
Yeah, well, in the old days, the ATO used to send you a letter every year which told you how much you owed, and I used to find that rather interesting at the time when I had a HECS debt. Now you got to log on to find out what it is. People don't necessarily do it. When I was researching this area a few years ago, I used to sort of ask every young person I met, what is your help debt? And some people could tell me to the last dollar, like they were really focused on it, but a lot of people had absolutely no idea. I'm thinking, well, actually, you're going to have to repay this amount, whatever it is. You should know what it is, and you should be factoring it into your decisions about what courses to take and whether to stay in uni and all these things.
One of the the ways you could reduce student debt is by reducing the cost of education. I just want to read one of the questions on the stream, which is, isn't one of the reasons education is so expensive is because there's been a massive expansion in the number of bureaucrats, equity and welfare officers, etc. on campus, and wouldn't a substantial cut in these numbers lower the costs for students without significantly reducing the quality of their experience?
So this is
Do
an
you have any
interesting
on that?
area. Yeah. So the share of university staff who are not academics has been pretty constant, about 58% for decades, but the composition has changed, and I think the question is getting at it a bit. I think the sad reality is if there are efficiencies in administration, which there in fact have been due to COVID, so about 75% of the job losses were for non-academic staff during COVID, this money would go to research rather than teaching on average. So we've actually got a very interesting cultural and structural issue that we've, for various historical reasons, combined higher education teaching and research in the same institution. And those institutions have found ways to basically use profits from teaching to sustain the research activity. So in some ways, to get to where your questioner is talking about, you actually need teaching-only institutions where the mission is entirely about the students, with no incentive to take any surpluses and spend it on research instead. And part of that demand-driven review that you mentioned right at the start that I worked on was to extend public funding to organisations that were teaching only. The then Liberal government accepted that recommendation, but in the same package decided to deregulate fees, and so the whole thing went down.
And I have a question here. So why is this issue framed as a battle between the young and the old, half of whom never attended university and instead practice a trade, rather than it being an elite class versus the underclass?
So I guess one of the things about expanding higher education is that kind of the elite masses thing doesn't work as well as it did at the start. And so if you go back to the arguments sort of made against free education, like former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser used to say that it was kind of a wharfie subsidising a lawyer's education. But now we've got 40-something% of young people attending uni, probably a larger percentage, at some time in their lives. And so that kind of divide is kind of not really working in the way that it used to. So I kind of don't like the sort of the mass elite system, even though there are obviously elite institutions within the higher education system. This is now something that very ordinary people aspire to, and I think politicians should be very, very careful about that. Even when going back to these over-education kinds of arguments, or about the demand-driven system. Like I used to speak to student groups during the demand-driven system, and some of that, we don't like it. Too much competition in the graduate labour market. But they're all assuming that it wouldn't be them who would be out without it. So it's got very difficult politics.
I've got another question here from the stream. I'm not sure if you can answer this one. How has the university sector been so captured by left-wing intellectuals?
Interesting question. So I would clarify this a bit by saying that this is mostly an issue in sort of humanities and education kind of faculties that Most of the university spending is in fact on the sort of the science and medical side rather than the humanities side. But you're right, this goes back a long time. I've tried to trace the history of this. It goes back at least to the 1930s during the Depression, which I think radicalised many people on campus. And then again in the 1970s. Now, I live in the Melbourne suburb of Carlton, which is basically right next to Melbourne University. And in the 1970s, Carlton was a slum. And middle-class people arriving at Melbourne University were shocked at the terrible squalor that people were living in. And so these things had radicalising effects at the time. But there's a bigger story than that. The same things happened globally. I think it's actually been a bit of a tragedy on both sides, because it means that academics are kind of not getting the range of views within their profession that they should. Serious intellectual perspectives that they should be taking into account, they don't necessarily know very much about. Liberal or conservative thought is often sort of taught in a very cliched, shallow way, which disadvantages everyone. But it's very hard to get out of this equilibrium, because if you are a conservative or liberal-leaning person, do you want to every day go to a workplace where vast majority of people totally disagree with what you're saying? It's a bit uncomfortable. And so I think probably new institutions like Campion College, the Catholic College, might be one way of dealing with this, but I don't think we're going to radically change the system.
What are your predictions regarding the new government and Albanese seeing what Biden is doing over in the US? Do you think that Albanese might interpret it in a way, because it is becoming more of an issue and it is becoming more relevant and being asked for? Do you think that there is any potential action that might be taken in line with what Biden's doing in the future?
I would say about a 1% chance of that. The reason is that HECS was a Labor idea. I think the policy consensus here that's been pretty successful. For the reasons it's been talking about, help is not destroying the finances of students and graduates in the way that it is in the United States. We simply don't have one of the key problems that Biden is trying to fix. Plus, the current government, I think, is broadly fiscally responsible. Currently, help repayments are running about $4 billion a year. Are they going to sacrifice a $4 billion a year stream of cash when they've got a terrible budget deficit? I don't think so.
So I've got another question in the comments. Is it the case that the conversion of TAFE-like institutions in the 80s into universities has led to all the new universities creating prestige departments like law, resulting in an oversupply of lower standard law students and a movement away from a trades and skill focus?
So universities tend to offer what students want to do, and students want to do law. Law has not sort of expanded wildly in the way people think, but it is much bigger than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And while it's true that most law graduates won't be lawyers, I'm a law graduate who's not a lawyer, people need to think about, what are their opportunities, what are their risks? And so if you are interested in law, chances are that your interests are more on the humanities end of the spectrum. And so what are your realistic options if that's where you are intellectually? And your realistic alternatives like arts or communications, on average, all do worse than doing law. And so I would say this is not really the problem that people think it is. Law does provide general kind of thinking and organizational skills, which are valuable in the workplace. But having done both law and arts, I would say law is not on average more difficult intellectually than arts, but you have to learn the whole lot. You can't just pick a few subjects to do your essay or your exam. And that's why it does require different skills in understanding everything in the topic rather than just selecting things. And I think that is valuable. Plus, in many jobs, even when you're not a lawyer, having some confidence in reading statutes and cases is useful.
Do you have any current statistics on the current debt that will be written off in, say, 5 to 10 years, especially over this current period of inflation? And do you think that's going to grow? And do you think there's going to be a lot of people not being able to repay their debts with the current cost of living?
So The amounts being written off every year are still pretty low, like a few tens of millions of dollars. That's because this scheme only started in 1989. So the people who were school leavers then are in their 50s now. Most people don't die until well after that. And so we actually are not seeing huge amounts being written off, though eventually that will start happening. I think, look, it's very hard to know where the labour market is going to go. At the moment, as you know, the labour market is extremely strong. And that tells me that we're actually going to see a significant increase in help repayments in the near term because many more people have jobs. Eventually, I expect, even if it's just inflation, wages will push up again, and that will help push people into higher repayment brackets. So I would predict the next 12 months to 2 years are probably pretty favourable for help repayment. But if we get another recession, repayments will go down again. But this is part of what the system is designed to do. It's supposed to smooth these things out. The big thing we could do to eventually repay is stop the deceased estate write-off, because I think a lot of that money will be in high-income households, but that's always been rejected so far.
Mm-hmm. And one thing about the efficiency of this, I know I have a few friends who have, for example, completed a degree and then they haven't even gone into that workspace. One of those coming to the top of my head would be criminology, is a degree I've seen a few friends go into, or even psychology. And then in the end, there was nothing efficient from that economically because they don't even go into that, and they'll go into just retail work, and there is no actual financial benefit from obtaining that degree. Is there a way that we can try through policy reach a better amount of efficiency regarding degrees and the long-term outcome?
So this goes to the earlier point about career choice. So I do think that people are possibly making naive choices about their job prospects. Now, there is a lot of information out there. It's vastly improved over the last 10 years or so, but it's not necessarily easy to find. It's spread across multiple different websites. And possibly when you're, focus on other things in year 12, you aren't necessarily thinking about exactly what job you'll do in 3 or 4 years' time after you finish your degree. There are also various what I call high-risk options that actually there are plenty of jobs for psychologists. It's a real growth field, but you actually need a master's degree to be a psychologist. And so we've got lots of people who are getting to stage one, that is, they've got a bachelor degree with a major in psychology or a psychology degree. But because there are very limited places in the master's courses, they're not making the transition to the profession of psychologist. And that is a flaw in the system, that we do reach this bottleneck where we've got all these people who want to be psychologists, we've got all this need for psychologists, but the education system is not performing very effectively on that. And one of the reasons is a lack of Commonwealth supported places in Masters of Psychology programs.
Samrat, did you have any more questions at all?
I had one question. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but a few of my friends from Sweden who come to Australia to study say that the Swedish government gives them loans when they study overseas. Is there a reason why Australia doesn't offer like an overseas loan program for students studying abroad?
So there is a small loan program called OS Help, which basically funds some of your ancillary expenses if you do, a semester overseas, but not for full courses overseas. I think the government has always been nervous about this. For example, you can't, as an Australian citizen, can't even do a subject at an Australian university on one of its campuses overseas because they're worried that you'll stay there and not repay. So overall, I think, look, it's a prudential policy to ensure that people stay in Australia and give Australia the benefits of the subsidy of higher education. But Sweden has a different philosophy, and there are many Swedes who end up studying around the world, including Australia. I'm not sure what percentage actually go home, but I can't see this happening in Australia, given a history of risk aversion around this.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us this Sunday. It's been a pleasure, and we'd really appreciate all of your input regarding this because it is becoming such a significant topic and it's definitely being talked about a lot more now. Thank you to the viewers for watching. This has been a Macquarie University Liberal Club production, and you can tune in every Sunday for new topics that are relevant.
Thanks, guys.